Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for this short series of introductory videos in which we showcase some of the key changes that we've made to our updated 2023-24 MIPS indemnity insurance policy. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Matthew Metcalf, who's the Underwriting and Product Manager. And also Julie Harris, who's the Professional Services Manager.
Hey, hi Owen, good to be here to go through the policy.
Great, thank you. So look, we've heard your feedback and many of you have told us that you'd like the policy to be clearer, simpler, easier to read. We're also really mindful of the challenges that you're all facing out there in the healthcare workforce. There's been many changes, many regulatory changes in recent times, and I think it's really important that our insurance policy covers you for some of these new and emerging areas. So, Julie, perhaps I can start today. We're talking about telehealth first of all. So the Medical Board of Australia recently introduced a guideline. It comes into effect on the 1st of September 2023. And in that guideline, the board sets out, kind of a few checklists about things to think about when you're conducting telehealth. But it also makes it very clear that the board doesn't support the use of what we call asynchronous telehealth. So that's where you're conducting a telehealth consultation where there hasn't been any real-time interaction with the patient, either in person, by video, or by telephone. And the board also makes it really clear that it doesn't support any prescribing or the provision of healthcare in those asynchronous circumstances. So Julie, can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about why this is important?
Yeah, sure, Owen. I think, telehealth's just become mainstream. It obviously got us through a really difficult time. And there's that expectation now that telehealth anywhere, anytime should be, available. There's a lot of pressure, I think, to sort of continue on telehealth without really stopping to think about where you are, where the patient is, and what sort of risk does that create. An important one is that jurisdiction, and anything that happens outside of Australia does expose members to potential complaints and potential claims and litigation that is not in a legal process that we're familiar with here in Australia. So, and we obviously all know about the crazy things that can happen in the US and those big damages awards that they're famous for. But there's lots of other countries where the legal process will feel very different, quite foreign, quite unfamiliar. And it's quite stressful actually when you're not in that country anymore, or your patient may be, but you are not. So they're not the things you think about day in, day out when you're agreeing to a telehealth consultation, but that is a risk. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind, is how long have I been out of the country? How long has my patient been out of the country? And is that exposing us to a greater risk of those things taking place? And I think also we've seen anonymous type complaints about, which might be completely unfounded and unfair, but are still complaints about the length of time in which those arrangements might exist. And I think that's just another thing to avoid if possible.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Julie. I think you really paint a picture of why it's so important for us to be thinking about telehealth, and particularly at the moment with, I guess international borders are reopening, we are travelling again, we're visiting family that we haven't seen for so long. Many of you are now attending conferences in person again, and, as part of continuous healthcare, you may want to follow up some results with a patient. So I think it's just really important to think about some of those jurisdictional issues if that situation arises. So as I said, these medical board guidelines come into effect from the 1st of September 2023. So I think it's really important, we can provide a link to those guidelines. It's just really important to make sure that you're familiar with and aware of those guidelines and what the board's recommendations are. But getting back to our policy, Matthew, I'm wondering if you can take us through exactly how the MIPS policy responds to some of these changes that we've seen in telehealth.
Yep, definitely. So overall, the MIPS policy is in line with the medical board guidelines. It's just our policy takes effect a few months earlier. We do have a few additional conditions when it comes to asynchronous telehealth.
Yep.
So the first one being that either you or another APRA registered medical doctor has a pre-existing clinical relationship with the patient. And the second one is that you have the ability to synchronously contact that patient if it's required.
After the consultation, is it?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And are there any other changes in the policy?
Yeah, so we do have some time frame and location-based restrictions in the policy. So that was just to limit the risk that Julie's mentioned previously. So in the case of if you're outside of Australia, you need to be within a 120-day period. So if you're overseas visiting friends and it does get over that 4-month period, the policy may not apply from that point. Inversely, if the patient's overseas and you're in Australia, that patient does need to be within the 90-day window. So if they're away for more than 3 months, the policy won't be able to apply.
Okay.
And the final one is if both yourself and the patient are overseas, then the policy won't apply there.
Okay. All right. So some important conditions in the policy to be aware of then. So I guess for me, the take-home message really is that telehealth, there's so many advantages and benefits to telehealth, and MIPS is definitely supportive of the use of telehealth, but there are some really important considerations to factor in when you're using telehealth, particularly when you're overseas, and particularly if the telehealth doesn't involve any real-time interactions with patients. I think the other important thing, as Matt's mentioned, is that if both you and the patient are overseas, then the policy doesn't apply. There won't be cover. So I think it's really important, if you are overseas and you conduct a telehealth consultation, you should probably do this anyways, just to double check exactly where in the world the patient is. And it might sound a bit strange to be suggesting this, but if you're overseas, you shouldn't assume necessarily that that patient that you're following up from back home in Australia is in fact in Australia at the time of that consultation. So just good practice, as well as following the other important guidelines and checklists that are in the board's new updated guideline to also check the location of your patient as well. And just the last thing to mention is that everything we've talked about in this video is in relation to telehealth and the limitations of telehealth overseas. It's really important that you remember that that does not apply to Good Samaritan Act. So if you're on an aeroplane and you're called to provide emergency assistance, or you're involved in or witness a motor vehicle accident, or you have to render some sort of medical assistance while you're overseas, that is covered, and it's covered worldwide under our Good Samaritan Act cover. Just the final thing I'd like to point out is that this video is for general information only. It's not intended to be a substitute for legal advice, nor is it intended to be an assurance that the policy will apply in your given personal circumstances.